Hello, everyone. Uh, Before we start the webinar, it'd be good for us to introduce ourselves. So I'll start with me. I'm Ajay Rana. I'm a director in our capital markets consulting team in PwC UK.
My name is Johannes Goldner. I work in our risk consulting team in the UK, mainly with Ajay, and we have got a special guest today.
Hi guys, my name is Alistair Moole and I lead our financial services AI practice here at PwC in the UK.
Right. So before we start running you through the materials, a couple of housekeeping points. So one is there is a box you will see on your screen where you can log your questions, and we'll respond to those questions at the end of the session. We are hoping to finish our presentation in 40 to 45 minutes, and we'll leave the last 15 minutes for questions. In terms of format, as we run through the materials, if you have any questions, let's keep it interactive and post your questions as we go along. We should be able to sort the questions as well as prioritize them as we go along. So starting with our very on slide one.
I guess just one point before we move on, Ajay. We have been advised by the organizers of the conference that please guys use Twitter freely during the webinar and leave comments on Twitter as well as asking us questions.
I think you can do that with the hashtag #RMWebinar.
Okay, fine. So in terms of the background to this webinar, we conducted a global study of risk functions in 2017, which was based on conversations with 17 global banks, including 10 GSIBs. And the focus of the study was to identify what trends within risk functions, as well as understand what the agenda of chief risk officers was. Now, as part of that study, it was quite a broad-based study, which included interviews as well as a comprehensive survey. But there were three things which were quite apparent from that study. So one was that it was clear that in most banks, especially in Europe and North America, risk functions were under pressure. And they were under pressure to make changes both to their operating model as well as to their cost base. And this was given the changes in the risk landscape, increasing prominence of new risks like cyber and so on. We expect significant changes to risk function size, having now spoken to those banks over the course of this year, as well as how accountabilities are distributed across the three lines of defense. And finally, we also see that banks are right at the beginning of that journey right now. And while some banks have made quite some progress over the last 1 year, there is still a great deal of work to be done. So we thought it was timely to have a webinar where we could, one, recap what the study was about and what were the main findings from the study. We could then move on to what have we seen leading banks focusing on in 2018, and then finally get into what we see as emerging priorities for 2019 to 2020. Then moving on to the first slide, which is around the recap of what we saw in the 2017 study. So first, a bit more information on the study. So as I mentioned, effectively, the key observations from the study were as you can see on the screen. One was across the industry, we noticed some similar change drivers across risk functions. The first one was around evolving business and operating models. So a key theme which came up in all conversations was that that the business was changing and risk needed to evolve along with it. There was the point around prominence of non-financial risks, which I mentioned earlier. There was obviously a lot of focus on risk functions around operational efficiency, and then there was also talk of all the new technologies and a feeling that risk functions were not leveraging those technologies as much as some of the other parts of the bank. There was also a consensus on what was required to get there. So there were some similar enablers which we picked up. So the first one was the need for it to be clear what the risk functions role was, and different banks saw risk functions role differently. So there were differences in terms of risk activities and mandate, but there was a need for clarity on what the role was and what the alignment was across the lines of defense. banks felt that there was need for a strategic approach to how new technology was being deployed. The view was there were parts of banks which were doing well, it was being done in pockets, and it needed to be picked up much more strategically. And then finally, what the study highlighted was that there was a need to address what were seen as too difficult to solve challenges. So IT architecture, alignment across business, risk, and other functions. And the view was that if we have to achieve the future operating model where we can be holistic in our coverage, where we can have a low cost base, we need to solve these questions. So that was the background.
I guess one further thing to add to that was next to new technologies, there was also broad recognition that there was also a need to rethink the composition of the workforce and also the ways of working. And I think broadly in terms of the time horizon that our stakeholders were looking at, given that some of these, in particular, too difficult to solve problems were not possible to address overnight. This is something that broadly was looked at over 3 to 5 years.
Okay. So then some of the data points which came up as part of the study. On the left-hand side, the first picture talks about the percentage of risk budget which they expected to spend on non-financial risks in 5 years' time, and most of those non-financial risks were quite low in 2017, but the budget was expected to increase by some banks, and there were some interesting themes there. So, for example, if you look at cyber risk, there were a couple of banks which expected to spend more than 5% of their risk budget on cyber risk in 5 years' time, as against what it was at that time, which was in the very first bucket. And you can see across a range of other risks where there was a view that in 5 years' time, banks would be spending more on these non-financial risks, and in some cases significantly more than it is today. We also asked the participants to look at cost reduction targets, and a number of banks looked at it in the range of 10%, but there were some who were looking at larger cost savings within risk. And as we have engaged with banks over the last 1 year after the study, we do think the number is more likely to be in the 20% range or 10 to 20% range rather than less than 10%, as there is increasing pressure and other parts of bank are achieving the savings. And then the third picture shows the spend on risk analytics, which was again varied, but there was one bank, for example, which was looking at massively increasing the spend on analytics. Now, in terms of what did it mean in terms of the future of risk function? So three main observations. One was risk function was expected to be leaner and more senior, and with a holistic coverage as all these non-financial risks became more prominent. I mentioned the cost reduction point. And there was a view that there was need for risk to champion emerging technologies, and then there was a third point, which is you needed new tools and capabilities to provide effective oversight and challenge. So many of these non-financial risks were seen as different from the traditional risks which banks used to manage, and the view was both the framework, how three lines of defense are laid out, and what kind of tools and capabilities are required are going to be different from the ones that the banks had at that time.
I guess to add a couple of points to that, looking at the picture of the risk budget, I think one of the interesting insights we did get was that the focus of a lot of banks in sort of the more digital risks, including information cybersecurity and operational resilience, had been on building this out in the first line. And I guess now the focus was turning to what would risk do. And so what we could see from the budget allocation was that a lot of the budget that would be spent on efficiently managing these risks would be at the moment spent in other functions, including technology, including procurement and the like.
Okay. So that was a recap of the study. Effectively, the view being that risk functions were looking to transform themselves, and there were major drivers for transformation, and there was focus on elements around cost, use of new technologies, and the need for risk to become leaner and more senior. Now, over 2018, we have seen there are different levels of progress which banks have made on the topic, but if we look at the leading banks, there are some key themes which are emerging. So one is around, there has been a lot of focus on the 4 points which you can see on the slide. The first is around the future vision and capabilities of risk. So a number of leading banks have done quite detailed analysis on, at a strategic level, around the effectiveness and efficiency of risk functions. And this includes external benchmarking, it includes looking at internally at how effective the risk functions are, and part of this is also driven by regulators asking some banks to evidence how they were future-proof, how they were being future-proof in terms of how they approached it. So that has been a focus area for some leading banks around what is the future vision and what kind of capabilities do we need in future, and varied levels of progress on this point. Some banks have articulated this in terms of a blueprint for change. Some are at early stages where they have a view on the quantum of change and are now working at looking at how they articulate it further. There has been progress made by several banks around accountability. So we give some examples where we have seen that come out quite clearly. So there is both because of ring fencing and to some extent because of Brexit, there is focus on the legal entity dimension, but then also the relative importance of those legal entities, setting up of boards in those legal entities, and things like that. There are banks which are focused on alignment of risk and finance processes, as many of you would recognize, and there are topics like stress testing, ICAP, IFRS 9, where the accountability between risk and finance has become more clear, where the processes are more clearly defined, and the handoffs have been formalized. There is credit is a focus area for a number of banks, and mapping out the end-to-end credit journey and thinking around how first line and second line participate in that process has become has gained quite a bit of prominence over the last year, with some banks making quite some progress in this. Operational risk is another area where we have seen examples where banks have either moved activities from second line to first line, or raise the stature of second line in some of the new risks. So there is focus on clarifying what second line does versus first line, and that has both driven effectiveness but then also led to efficiency gains. And then finally, when it comes to non-financial risks like information cybersecurity, op resilience, third-party risk, there has been quite a lot of focus on growing first line skills. There is some early start on second line skills we have seen as well, but there's much more focus on first line when it comes to those risks. The third area where we have seen focus is location strategy, and there are banks which have done this very well historically. There are others who are getting into the space and looking at how they could leverage offshoring. So the themes we have seen in this space in 2018 are high value activities getting offshored, so activities around modeling, model validation, so focus on how those activities could be moved offshore or outsourced. There is a combination, depending on the business model of the bank and its geographical footprint. It's a combination of in-country hubs or near offshore models. And then finally, there is increasing focus on how to make offshoring successful. So setting up a strong middle management, focus on leadership, focus on developing a good location strategy in terms of identifying territories where the skills lie and so on. So that has been a focus area as well. But it's a growing area of importance for a number of banks who are under cost pressures. And finally, around automation, there is what we have seen is that the automation tends to have been based in 2018 on components rather than end-to-end process. So some banks have made good progress around, for example, spreading of financial information. So how financial information gets shared and extracted in the organization. Things like stress testing, submission templates, and controls. So parts of the process which were manual could be automated through use of robotics and other technologies have been automated. But as I said, the focus has been on process components which can be easily automated rather than looking at the end-to-end process, which is something which is more time consuming and requires a more strategic lens.
I guess to add a couple of points around enforcing the accountabilities. banks have gone to various degrees between first and second line in different risks. Now, operational risk has been quite a big focus for a number of banks, in particular around the controls testing and assessments as part of, for example, RCSAs, where some of the operational risk teams have become quite light and have shifted that into first line. A second piece around the location strategy, I think there's banks that have had various degrees of success with that, which we have heard across different combinations. There's banks that have traditionally done that and have increasingly now used that to set up kind of hubs with centers of excellence. There's other banks who have struggled much more in getting value out of it, and in particular what we have also discussed with a number of the clients we've worked with is what is actually still valuable at the moment, because some of the investment required in the salary arbitrage now, it's more about thinking much harder what makes sense in the longer term.
Now, in addition to the four things which I mentioned on the previous page, which is around vision, clarifying accountabilities, location, and automation, some banks have gone further and invested in a few areas. So one is around deep dive process analysis, which is more around understanding, articulating the end-to-end process, and looking at ways to analyze how that process could look different. And this has either been done on a basis which is more traditional, which is looking at and basically working to articulate the process and then physically working out what could change. There have also been some of the new technology-based approaches where some banks have invested in how to infer the process from various automated data points like machine logs and things like that, and then create a digital version of the process which can be easily simulated. So we see different trends on the topic, but the focus is looking at major end-to-end processes and thinking of how they could be either simulated with various options, or how you could look at change in those processes using that end-to-end process as the basis. We're also seeing focus towards a process-led organization in some banks, and this is becoming quite important, for example, because of, say, the regulatory focus here, at least in the UK, on resilience, and having a view on processes and where the vulnerabilities are, where things could go wrong, is becoming quite important, and a number of controls and analysis is being pivoted around processes, and this is true for risk as much as it's for the rest of the organization. And that's the third point, which is we're seeing at least some examples where we are seeing things like RCSAs, which have traditionally always been anchored in a business line risk type kind of framework, and moving them towards more a process lens. So this is becoming quite a focus area. The other thing which we have seen some banks do is have a much more data-driven approach to workforce management. So effectively using or collecting granular data on activities, where resources spend their time, and having a process through which that information can be refreshed on a regular basis, and then using that as the basis to define profiles, define where have more database plans, and then budgeting and planning for talent. So that's becoming the other area, and some banks have invested in tools to be able to do this. There has been a lot of spend in terms of thinking through how that information can be used and disseminated and made a part of regular, say, the medium-term planning process of the risk function. And then the third area where we have seen some banks go further is on infrastructure enhancement. So especially often driven by regulatory programs like BCBS 239 and to some extent FRTB, there is a focus on improving data accessibility, investing in things like data lakes and data warehouses, also making information more real-time, focus on front-to-back integration. So all those, there are ongoing programs which are expected to deliver significant enhancements in these areas, and then also in terms of standardization of tools and templates. So there is a lot of focus on these topics, and whereas we haven't seen many banks where we would say this is perfect, but there are ongoing programs which we expect to deliver a lot of value over the coming years.
And so I think on the infrastructure point, some interesting things that we have seen is also that banks are actually starting to really spend on this and to fix things that are underlying and were thought to be too difficult to solve. The second thing is also that it's not just always the risk team paying for this, but that there are also other interested sponsors where the business may not just want risk to be more efficient, but where they may want much faster decisioning capabilities, which do require risk systems to be much more integrated and able to operate at a much different level.
I see that definitely as a feature of the post-crisis budget requirement pressure. In the bulk of IT budget is getting spent on regulatory requirement spend and updates, etc. And this is certainly one way for businesses to get value out of that by addressing their overall technology infrastructure and part of their change programs, such that using things which are driving regulatory compliance to also drive the overall efficiency and data handling of their business.
Okay, so that's so. If I had to summarize, I think if I had to summarize what happened over 2018, we've seen some good progress made by banks around both articulating their vision, kind of clarifying what kind of targets they should be aiming for, making good progress on infrastructure investments, and all this we think puts banks in a good position and builds some momentum behind the transformation. So over 2019, we expect there to be continued momentum, both around articulating in some cases what the risk function of the future looks like, but in many cases on delivering that. So there are three themes which we have laid out on this page. The first one is around articulating and socializing the vision of the risk function. So both defining what are those granular objectives risk function is seeking to achieve, what are the underlying design principles, what are the target capabilities. So we expect it to become richer and more granular. We do expect banks which haven't invested in workforce management tools, we do expect more banks to kind of focus on the topic and either invest in tools or invest in analysis of activities of the staff to both think about efficiency, but then also think about what the future activities, skills, profiles need to look like. There is increasing focus on integrating change portfolios. So how does business risk and other functions, how does the change agenda get integrated? So there are banks which do it well, but in many cases it is still siloed. So there is a focus on, once the vision has been articulated and banks are thinking of delivering it, how does the change portfolio get integrated? And then ultimately we expect more progress on what are the benefits which are going to come from the investments which are happening. So effectively, as I mentioned on the previous page, there has been a lot of focus on infrastructure investments, often driven by regulatory needs. But what we expect going forward is it becoming more and more clear what business benefits can be derived from those investments. In some cases, it's more a question of articulation. In other cases, we expect a bit of iteration around how some of them can be repurposed or leveraged to derive value. The second box is more around clarifying the role of second line around non-financial risk. So there has been progress on this across banks, but this is an area which is evolving. So we expect more clarity on what is the second line role, what kind of investment or tools would second line be looking at, what kind of controls are required for these risks. And there's an area where both within the bank between risk and the management, but then also between risk and the regulators, we expect the area to evolve and the role, the size, and the skills of second line to carry on being invested in. And then the third area is around continued focus on delivering infrastructure enhancements. So as I said, there are banks which have made good progress on this, often driven by regulation, but there are others which we expect to pick up on the topic. There is increasing recognition of the need for, or the future need for, more computing power as data sources are becoming more and more varied. So we're seeing some initial thinking on the topic, and then we also expect more progress for 2019 on frameworks around things like, for example, open source software. So as banks think about piloting new technologies and as they think about using alternative sources of data, we expect more work on what kind of frameworks are required to manage the risks arising out of these and so on. Okay. Then we also thought it would be good to talk a bit about efficiency, which is obviously a focus area for a number of banks as risk functions come under pressure to manage costs. So we effectively identified three broad areas where there is emphasis, and we expect there to be a more holistic coverage of all of these themes as banks aim to as we go through 2019. So the first is around the management of demand. So what does the risk function effectively do? So how do you and the themes we have seen early indication of is around aligning change initiatives, for example. So how do you get value from investments? How do you kind of align different change initiatives which are happening within risk? The second area is around how to manage demand. So demand for various services which risk delivers to business. So how do you what is the formal approach to kind of managing that demand? There is emphasis on organization and location strategy, so which is the other lever we see around efficiency. So optimizing staff with fungible skill sets, building utilities. We have seen some evidence of that, and we see that as a key lever around efficiency. We also see benefits from emerging technologies. That's emerging as quite an area of focus when it comes to things like credit, for example, or even operational risk, where we've seen a lot of focus on what are the alternative data sources which are available, but how could new technology be used to standardize processes to deliver better connectedness? Things like credit sanctioning, anomaly detection. So there is focus on using some of the new technologies in this area. So in a few minutes, we have also kept some time for a specific case study which Alistair will run you through, which talks about credit risk as a use case, but there is focus on using emerging technologies as a means to drive efficiencies.
I think that ties to the theme, the post-financial crisis theme, which has certainly been part of my career, where we've identified the issue being to do more with less and get it right every time. And I think as early as 2010, in my work, I was identifying that really the only path to doing that is technology. I'm not saying that technology doesn't come with its own problems, but you're faced with a situation where you can only increase efficiency, you can only increase the capacity of your teams through the use of new approaches, new working methods, and new technologies. And to not do so is basically condemning yourself to a very inefficient place on the map.
Okay. Then, so besides effectiveness and efficiency points which we made earlier, we have seen some banks identify early use cases around emerging technologies, and we do expect significant progress in this area over 2019 and 2020, which is effectively use cases being crystallized into pilots, and banks developing ways and means in which this new technology can be used to deliver both effectiveness in certain areas, but then also as a basis for efficiency. There are four use cases which we have identified on this topic. I will pass on to my colleague Alistair.
Yes, certainly. I think one of the key ones that is being enabled by effectively the much cheaper availability of compute, the new AI technologies, is that field of natural language processing, which has opened up a whole field of unstructured data, so emails, news articles, operational risk reports, basically any piece of text which previously was in your repository and you couldn't access and you couldn't get that information from, is now available to your processes in a way using the statistical NLP frameworks that contributes to the value being produced by any model, by any process within your organization. We see in the markets area that being extended to the machine vision space, to private equity and other parts of the hedge fund community using machine vision to identify opportunities in the markets. And it's certainly that type of approach is going to cascade through the entire banking structure. Anything that shows value and shows returns in the market is going to get adopted further down the stream. And it's all about identifying really those areas of data which previously you thought were out of reach. There's a strong concept of the availability heuristic within the modeling area, and by making more information available, you can certainly address factors in your models which previously you couldn't even consider, and identify those things. Concepts like market sentiment, more specific areas of sentiment. Using these techniques to drive relevance of particular news articles, particular regulatory outputs, speeches, all kinds of human-generated unstructured data, and deliver those into your process such that the person who needs to know about those things is getting one article or one email into their inbox and that they are going to read, compared to, I think, where the technology was 5 or 10 years ago, where you were getting a list of 5 stories, none of which were particularly relevant to your particular use case. And we see that as certainly a practically zero risk step for these areas of the business to take, in that you still have full control over that process. It is purely driving efficiency, it's driving access to information, it's improving the efficiency of your existing human workforce, with no downsides. It doesn't look like the kind of AI ethical and responsibility conundrum of connecting an algorithmic trading system to the markets. It is a very safe and very easy way to bring these technologies to bear on the problems that your businesses face. I think the second area, I think we touched on earlier, was around the process inference and simulation areas. The concept of a digital twin is not a new one, but in the same way as these AI and machine learning techniques are driving gains in the unstructured data area, we're also seeing new approaches, new methodologies being deployed in the process inference area. So the likes of, instead of sitting down and interviewing your staff in order to determine what a process looks like, using methodologies which use statistical NLP, modern logging techniques, modern technology approaches to actually infer processes from communications data, from systems usage data, from access patterns, rather than relying upon the conceptual idea of what an ideal process looks like, taking that right back to the data and using that as your ground truth and modeling from there, which shows far better returns and a far more accurate mapping to what your process is, and equally is far faster to deploy than sitting down and interviewing all of your staff.
And we have seen some applications of this in some of the banks, especially around the credit process, but then also thinking about some of the other processes, say both around operational risk, but then also things like, say, model risk, which are more bespoke, and and banks are considering how you could use something like that to infer efficiency opportunities and areas where the process could become more effective.
Yeah, I think one of the key ways of identifying those types of processes are looking for patterns where there's a single communication pathway into that process team, where the bulk of inquiries are being handled via email, where that's the initiation process. Equally, systems like Jira, like ServiceNow, any piece where there's a defined workflow and defined methodology of interaction with the team in order to deliver the work, shows real possibilities of deploying these digital twin models on a very low cost, very high return basis. The third area then I think we're seeing is the area of predictive analytics, and the concepts behind that are not unknown to the risk community. These are statistical methodologies, but I think a lot of the machine learning and AI approaches allow an introduction of a much more fuzzy logic to those pieces, using probabilistic modeling rather than a purely linear statistical approach. and we see the approaches having dramatic impact in other industries around predictive maintenance, around approaches like that within the airline industry, and it's certainly my view that in order to become proactive, in order to get in front of risk, which is obviously the desire of every bank's risk function, you need to have a predictive capability. You need to be planning for when these limit breaches may occur in the future so you can address them before that breach actually occurs.
And I think here there is some quite interesting use cases that also then answer questions. So if risk is, for example, to evolve into a function that provides more value-add analytics, what could it do? And some of the things would, for example, be proactively identifying vulnerable customers that, due to some indicators that, or factors that the model picks up, appear to be heading towards financial distress, or so, say, as a change in spending patterns or something else. And that could then proactively be raised by risk to the right relationship managers so that they get in touch with the customers before the customer actually does fall into duress.
Yeah, certainly, and we've worked on a number of POCs that address exactly that area of it. So customer vulnerability, customer suitability, complaint identification. There is a myriad of approaches of fusing the very high levels of customer data, whether that be at the retail, commercial, or investment banking levels of the organization, in order to make better actions, have better outcomes for your clients. And that's certainly one of the things we focus on in our responsible and ethical AI products is around, well, this having dual benefits, not just for the provider, but also for the clients. And that's certainly a key focus of the way these technologies need to be deployed. The approaches, the awareness of issues like bias, of the use case criticality of the AI system, etc. And that brings me, I suppose, to our fourth category around feature analysis. So using these much more advanced correlation engines to be able to, and using them in a way that you can identify the correlation factors, the covariance pieces that are important to your model, and extract from that meaning from quite sophisticated modeling techniques, which we all understand in the context of the linear model what the somewhat what each of the factors means, but in the machine learning context, within random forests, within neural networks, etc., you actually need to do a considerable amount of work in order to extract out that. But having done that work, having used a tree interpreter to determine your features, having used approaches like LIME and SHAP to extract the value from a neural network, what you do get is you get a much more detailed explanation of the interactions between those features, which you wouldn't be able to discover using traditional linear modeling methods, and you get from that value which is not necessarily obvious to the human actor at the begining. So there's a couple of pieces of work we've done out there around explainable AI, around responsible AI, which and there are papers on our websites which you can look at, which address those pieces. And should any from the audience have further questions on that, then we'd ask you to raise them in the chat afterwards. So then that takes us on to one of our key use cases, which is a technology pilot that we ran with one of the large European investment banks. And subsequently, we've retooled to use our own news source here internally at PwC. This proof of concept was focused around increasing efficiency and adding value to the entire credit analyst lifecycle, so the end-to-end of data gathering through report generation, and how machine learning and AI might, and the new technology landscapes might impact that. To that end, we took unstructured data from the likes of from a news provider, in this case Dow Jones DNA Factiva. We took structured data from financial data repository, and we joined those two things using a bunch of modern technologies, using Azure Cloud, using Red Hat Linux, using Postgres, one of the latest beta versions, and it allowed us to do efficient windowing across the news data, a bunch of open source libraries, including spaCy and NNTK. And we fused that with a proprietary PwC natural language generation Python library, which was developed specifically for this use case in order to take all of that information. We trained on two different features of the news and of the existing linear model, and used that to generate a full report lifecycle and a human readable report at the end of that. And that then is the case study on the next page, and the value that the client saw from that was that we got 6 years of information out of we got 6 years of news information from the provider. We took that and fused it into the platform you see on your screens at the moment. What we have here is a platform which was allowing us to score the news sentiment, in that we trained at one level on the ratings transition within our news corpus. We use a +9 to -9 sentiment score. As you can see, the news stories on the left-hand side of this are all scored versus that sentiment. I think if you were then able to drill down into each of the news stories and see why the model had rated that a particular rating, it immediately took you using attention models within the natural language processing arena to identify the sentences, the phrases, etc., which the machine was looking at in order to identify that this was a negatively scored news story. This was applied across the portfolio based upon the risk weightings of the portfolio, the sizes of each of the pieces, the deltas that were being run, and fusing that with the sentiment piece from the news stories allowed you to populate the most relevant news to the credit analyst for that portfolio to the top of that pile to be read first. And we see that style of approach as being the best practice in how you can get additional information, additional value out of unstructured data into any of your pipelines. Going back to the page, we then had a second machine learning model which allowed us to model the PD. One of our interesting insights about this was that replacing the existing modeling framework entirely is not the right way to go about this. Our learning showed that the best way to approach it is to build this as a challenger model to your existing linear modeling process, to allow the machine learning pieces to do the parts of the equation that they are good at, in terms of taking in the news information, replacing any expert judgment within your modeling framework, but still relying upon the traditional linear models for the core structured data analysis. No matter what you do within a credit life cycle, debt to EBITDA is going to remain a key driver of the ratings classification and the PD model, and it's only marginal in terms of where you add in news and other pieces to that. This gives you this fused model gives you the benefit of both worlds, and it gives you strong explainability around your traditional structured data model. But in addition to that, gives you the flexibility between data releases, between modeling periods, between model validation cycles of the machine learning models to adapt to new news information as it comes in. I think the rest of the things we've shown there are all traditional parts of a portfolio modeling approach. What we did find was using the random forest regressor allowed us to look at different risk sensitivity and different risk factors across different parts of that tree, which is slightly different to the way you think about a linear model, in that linear model would apply to your whole landscape. the flexibility that added gave us additional value to the risk modeling framework.
So I think that that brings us to the end of the presentation. So we will we'll be happy to take questions and as we go along now. We can see some of the questions come through.
So our first question here is a question about how do you go about managing the model risk inherent to AI and machine learning models. And I think to an extent I addressed an element of that, which is that we view the best way of deploying these, certainly in the credit cycle, as being as challenger models. We actually think the likes of the confusion matrix between a standard linear approach, a simple standard modeling approach, and that used in advanced AI and machine learning models can potentially give you insight into things which you might not otherwise identify. You can use that confusion matrix, that difference between the outcomes being supplied by a more traditional model and the machine learning models to potentially highlight things or factors and features which are important or which you haven't addressed in your machine learning model, which require the level of human insight. So as a mining tool itself, that difference is very strong. A lot of the other side of it, the other questions around data bias, data control, data cleaning for AI and machine learning models, I think are well addressed by exactly the corporate governance and ethical approaches that apply to the human elements of management within banking. In that a ethically driven, correctly governed business will deploy exactly those same rules to how it approaches the risk inherent in the machine learning models.
Okay. So the second question we have: how do we consider climate change in risk management monitoring? So again, we are increasingly seeing climate change as an emerging non-financial risk alongside risks like cyber and vendor, where there is focus on articulating what the role of risk function is, and then and defining relevant controls around the topic. We haven't seen second line significantly building frameworks on the topic, but it's an area of focus, and we expect it to evolve more. We have seen focus on linkages between climate change and credit, which is another area which is becoming quite pertinent. We've seen some work being done by banks around that area.
We've also actually done this as part of our work here, some work with the Task Force on Climate Change in identifying corporate responses to climate change disclosures within their documents in order to help drive. So using exactly the approaches we're talking about in the sense of taking unstructured data and using it and driving into a process. This is something that the Task Force on Climate Change is using in order to better address, to better understand exactly the problem and how they can approach this from a governance perspective and improve the corporate approach to this global problem.
The next question we are seeing is: do we see a correlation between maturity of risk culture and the degree to which investments are coordinated between business and risk? I would say, in principle, yes. So if organizations have a mature risk culture and there are open conversations and you got alignment of incentives to some level, then you would see that. But I think incentives is quite a significant incentives play quite a significant role on the topic. So I wouldn't see a direct correlation. I would see risk culture as being important to drive consistent behaviors and avoid tail risks to things like reputation, but I would doubt culture on its own would play a significant role to drive how investments are coordinated to a significant level, but it plays an important role to ensure that the right issues are highlighted. There is progress made on incentives. There is spend on training, and you manage the regulatory reputation risk around the topic.
Yeah, I think to the extent it goes beyond risk culture, I think it extends into firm culture overall. As to, we hear repeatedly of the issues of siloism within banking. I think more siloed firms, whether that's even ones with a very aggressive risk culture, suffer from some problems about how to solve these problems and use technology to address it, because it is the best practice approaches to technology now are ones which, driven by the likes of the Agile framework, actually enforce engagement between the business, between the technology owners, between the SMEs, and it's only through that kind of culture change in terms of technology delivery that enforces that business engagement that we're seeing more successful IT and technology based products and solutions being delivered. And I don't think that actually in any way correlates with specifically a risk culture. I think it's much more of a company culture piece of.
I would say, the more I think of it, it's incentives which play a big role. Johannes gave an example earlier where we're seeing an example where the business was funding investments in certain enhancements to risk because they saw it as quite relevant to generating insights around customers, improving customer experience, and then things like that. So to the extent we see risk culture driving consistent, harmonized incentives between risk and business, then the answer would be yes.
I do think one thing that we raised, which is quite important and which we think is still a priority for a lot of banks, is getting essentially not just the risk function leadership together, but also then key other executives in business and also technology in particular, and agreeing where does the firm, given where its business model is moving and sort of the risk environment, where does it see the risk function as being positioned, and agreeing on that. I think that slots in with the overall risk or culture comment that you made, Alistair. And if that is landed, I guess then there will be much more of an alignment in priorities and investments.
What are the main risks you believe banks should focus on in 2018? So I would say absolutely the focus is on risks like cyber, vendor, climate change. So the non-financial risks where traditionally we have seen first line growing in stature, there has to be more focus coming from second line on both in terms of the second line has the right skills and capabilities to provide challenge. But I would also say in terms of the stature of risk functions, how does risk develop the right stature in those areas to be able to challenge on an ongoing basis is becoming quite important around those risks. So I would expect increasing focus on those risks.
Yeah, I think the question is probably what do banks intend to get out of it. So on the efficiency agenda, just by definition, credit risk remains in most of the larger, and in particular universal banks, still the risk on which risk functions spend the most or have the most headcount. So that will need to come out of that. Otherwise, I agree with Ajay, it is the non-financial risks, and I guess investment has so far mainly focused on the first line, so in business where the risk is actually managed, and that is also where regulators are pushing towards. But then now I think the question is also what role does risk actually play, and does a bank endow or equip risk to be able to provide the proper oversight and challenge, and that includes both in terms of building out the skill sets as well as providing tools and capabilities. And looking at efficiently managing some of these newer risks, we feel that it is going to require using some of the capabilities that have been unlocked by now, as Alistair was saying, the availability of more compute, as well as the accessibility of data. And so we feel that some of the things around, say, efficiently managing information and cybersecurity will also be enabled by potentially algorithms running in the background.
Yeah. Yeah. So the other question we have seen is around RCSAs. So what do we believe is the best way for banks to conduct RCSAs, and how frequently? So I think this is one of the areas where we expect emerging technology to play a role. So we have seen increasing focus on two areas, and one is how do you anchor RCSAs around processes. So far the focus has been around risk categories and business lines, but with focus on things like resilience, which are more process-driven constructs. There is focus on what does the RCSA tell about processes, or how is it anchored in processes. The other area is use of emerging technologies to extract what the right controls are and what are the most material risks down from the operational data, which is the other area where we see increasing focus. And if we are right on both of these, i.e. focus on process and use of emerging technologies to build a more bottom-up view of what drives operational risk, I think that would fundamentally change how operational risk is assessed, as well as the role of RCSAs.
And I think to add to that, there's probably also the value that you get out of RCSAs. For the time being, there's an enormous amount of effort spent on it. But more often than not, there's then some kind of a heat map that gets produced, and afterwards it's not that much beyond that. So we have started seeing banks pivoting away from just purely quantitative metrics for operational risk and linking it directly into the RCSAs, and then linking into a tool such as using structured scenarios or so to complement the RCSAs and assessing if specific events were to happen, how would they unfold and what would that mean, and how is the bank in a place to defend itself.
Okay. Okay, so the next question is what are the requirements for deployment of machine learning and other technologies at scale?
I think with all things, to do anything at scale, it's about having a plan. The technology landscape, there are already a lot of approaches out there, but setting out a plan, setting out the correct governance frameworks for that, the correct measures for when you're going to identify success, when you're going to identify failure. Ultimately, machine learning, AI, other technologies looks exactly like the current technology landscape that is deployed in banks. I think an awful lot of that. That landscape is transferable to machine learning, with the additional pieces of recognizing data provenance, the inherent statistical risks that exist within the machine learning landscape, that you need to have specific controls around the statistical modeling, around not overfitting, around the appropriateness of these models, which is all, from my perspective, defined by the use case criticality of that model.
Ajay, last one for you.
How do you expect the skills mix within the risk function to change, and over what time frame? So the time frame, as I've mentioned, I mean, we do see it as a 3-year journey or a 3 to 5 year journey, wherein we will see the skill mix evolve. The nature of the change, a few things. So we would expect more focus on tech skills. We would expect more focus on ability to, so moving away from resources who can work with manual analysis of data towards people who can work with alternative data sources, can extract data from new sources of data and then add value along those lines. So we'll see more skills around that area. We do see also a more senior team, which effectively does mean that you would have more niche skills. One of the things which also came up in a number of conversations is around communication. So effectively risk colleagues who can, or risk functions which can articulate implications, articulate stories, and effectively help in producing management information which is digestible, which tells a story, and so on.
Okay.
Okay.
So we are out of time, I think, but we will. Any remaining questions, we'll aim to answer them and put them, I think, on our blog.
Yes.
That's the intention.
If anybody has any more detailed questions or wants to pick anything up on a side conversation, more detail, we're more than happy. Our contact details will be made available.
Thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.